Hi everyone. We had the non-confidence vote in Parliament today, and I thought I'd make a quick video about it. Obviously, I'm not in my studio today. I don't even have a tripod. I'm in a hotel room, so excuse the video and audio quality. So the tone of the video today is going to be a little more casual, but hopefully you still enjoy it. I want to talk about what happened with the confidence vote, but I also want to talk a bit about how I analyze and predict things. Before we get started, I want to show you what I said about the vote a couple of weeks ago when it was first announced.
I don't have a crystal ball, but what I expect to happen here is that the Conservatives will call the vote, the motion will fail with the NDP and the Bloc both voting against it, then Poilievre will blame it on the NDP Liberal coalition in the English media, which will probably work, and blame it on the Bloc Liberal alliance in the French media, which probably won't work.
So, like I said, we had the vote today, and the Bloc and NDP both voted against it. It was pretty obvious this was going to happen even before the parties announced their voting intentions. The NDP needs more time to distance themselves from the Liberals, and the Bloc needs more time to shore up their support in Quebec. Also, like I said, pretty much right after the vote, Poilievre posted two things on Twitter. One was a post in English calling out the NDP, and one was a post in French calling out the Bloc. Someone on Twitter was surprised that I predicted not just the result, but also the Conservative response afterwards in detail. Really, this vote was never intended to succeed. The Conservatives are doing it because they want to tie the NDP and the Bloc to an unpopular Liberal government, and you're probably going to see them introducing a lot more confidence motions over the next year. So really, if you understand the underlying motivations in Canadian politics as well as some of the strategies they're using, these things become very, very predictable. You might have seen that the Bloc has announced that they're going to push for an election if they don't get a couple of demands met by the end of October, but really this is kind of an idle threat. The Liberals right now are in a minority position, but it's by a very slim margin. They currently have 153 seats in Parliament, or 156 if you count the 3 people who are elected as Liberal MPs but are currently sitting as independents. That means they really only need 12 or 13 extra votes to maintain confidence. So the Bloc alone can't call for an election with the Conservatives. The Conservatives, Bloc, and NDP all have to agree that they want an election all at the same time. And the thing is, the Conservatives are currently very firmly in majority territory if an election were to be called today, so the NDP and the Bloc don't really have any incentive to call an election in the short term. Now, the reason I think the Conservative strategy is not going to work in Quebec is because the Bloc Quebecois traditionally is aligned with either the Conservatives or the Liberals when they need to maintain the balance of power in Parliament. So trying to attach them to the Liberal Party is not really going to convince a lot of people in Quebec that a Conservative majority is in their best interest. I think they'd much rather see a Conservative minority government with the Bloc Quebecois holding the balance of power so they can get more wins for Quebec. So my expectation is that when the election is eventually called, the Bloc will actually pick up some more seats in Quebec. On the flip side, the NDP isn't really competing with the Conservatives for a lot of seats. They're more competing with the Liberals. So it's in their interest to wait a little longer for Liberal popularity to continue to drop so they can pick up more seats in the next election. As a result, my personal feeling is that we're probably going to be waiting a while until we see an election, if not all the way to the legislative election date in October of next year. Now, on a related note, I've been making videos for long enough now that some of the things I've been saying over the past year and a half have started to not exactly come true, but be reported more in the mainstream media. I've said a lot of times that I don't really make predictions in my videos, I more describe things that are already happening that you just might not know about yet. And the way I do that is actually pretty simple, it's just that not a lot of people do it. We have a lot of really, really rich data sets, both from StatCan and from other economic institutions or just other reports. There's lots of ways to find data out there. But I think the key to being able to figure out what's going on is to actually be curious and ask yourself questions, and then ask yourself, how would I get the answer to that question? And I think it's really important that when you're going out and looking for answers, you don't already have an answer in mind, or at the very least, you're not committed to it, and you're willing to accept that you might be wrong. It's very, very easy, and a lot of people do it, but to get attached to one idea that you think is right, you take your hunch, and you go out and pursue data that confirms your hunch. But as economist Ronald Coase once said, if you torture the data long enough, it'll tell you anything. I think the key thing to understanding what's going on now is to look for the data that answers your question and accept that answer, whatever it may be. Now, besides figuring out what's going on, the second part is figuring out why it's happening. And to me, I think the key to that part is listening to what people are saying and how they're feeling about things. A pitfall a lot of economists fall into is that they think that everybody thinks like an economist and is perfectly rational. But ordinary people who have imperfect knowledge and imperfect information and imperfect analysis skills make up the majority of everything. So once you get a feel for the pulse of the people, you'll understand why things have happened. And then once you have the data side that's telling you what's happening and the behavioral and psychological side that tells you why it's happening, you can synthesize those two things together and get a much better understanding of the situation, and that will give you a little bit of an ability to anticipate what's going to happen in the future. And this is really how I saw us building into a crisis of debt and high home prices for the last 15 years. I would analyze home prices versus what it would cost to rent an equivalent place or how much money you could make as an investor, and it really didn't make any sense. It wasn't a rational pricing system. But that made a lot of sense when I would talk to ordinary people and they would tell me their irrational ideas about housing. A lot of people thought that it was a bulletproof investment and that it was worth paying any amount for, and that prices would continue going up forever, regardless of what the actual math showed. So, as interest rates remained low, I saw people borrowing more and more money and pushing home prices up higher and higher, and not really being concerned about the debt because they always thought that home price increases would cover it and that interest rates would remain low forever. But since I saw people basically pushing themselves to the breaking point and borrowing as much as they could, even at record low rates, I realized that they were very, very vulnerable to interest rate increases. So I had no idea when interest rates were going to go up, but I knew that when they did, it was going to turn from a looming crisis into a real crisis. And that's more or less what we're seeing now. Now, people still ask me if I think the housing bubble is going to pop. First of all, if you compare with the 1990s crash in real estate, our real inflation-adjusted home prices have dropped more than they did in that crash. The big difference is, it's only taken us 2.5 years to get from the peak to where we are now, but in the 1990s, it took 9.5 years. And again, I don't have a crystal ball, but if you ask me, I think that big first price decline is pretty much over now, and nominal prices are going to go sideways for a long time, but the value of homes is going to keep getting eroded by inflation over the next several years. And the reason I think that has a lot to do with the psychology of homeownership in Canada. First of all, people don't have a good grasp of the difference between nominal prices and real inflation-adjusted prices. So if they buy a place for $500,000 and then 15 years later it's still worth $500,000, they can convince themselves that they haven't lost any money, even though inflation has eroded the value quite a bit. This is actually really similar to what we saw in the 1990s. The second thing is, I don't think we're going to see a lot of people panic selling. People are only going to sell if they absolutely positively have to. And this is more or less because people think that housing is the bedrock of not only their lifestyle, but also their finances. People use it as a retirement plan, as a nest egg, as all of these things, when really it should just be a place to live. However, that does mean that a lot of people, if they can keep making their payments, are going to stay in the house even if it's not financially advantageous to do so. The thing is, the emotional side of making a really big decision weighs a lot more heavily on people than making a small decision many times in a row. So continuing to make your monthly payments and being financially stressed by it is not going to bother people as much as selling their home at a loss, for example. People ask a lot if we're going to see a 2008 type scenario here, but I don't quite think so. The thing is, in 2008, home prices crashed and a lot of people lost their homes, but they ended up resetting afterwards fairly quickly. I think what we're seeing in Canada is going to be a lot more insidious in that people are not going to lose their homes, but they're going to be very financially stressed for many years trying to maintain the debt on those homes. And I say that's more insidious because although they might not lose their homes, they'll lose a lot of opportunities and experiences that they might have had in those years if they weren't having to carry so much debt. And as far as I can see, the data backs up my opinion, and this is why we haven't been seeing a big spike in home prices after the rate cuts like the real estate industry was predicting. The thing is, they're just looking at a few simple variables and not looking at the human aspect of it. If we look at the data around what's going on with households right now, we see that debt service levels are higher, people are spending a lot more of their income on debt, people who are getting new mortgages right now have a much higher debt service ratio than before. We're seeing more homes with a negative savings rate, and we're seeing a lot of stuff like defaults on things like installment loans or auto loans, more people carrying a balance on their credit card, and a rapid increase in credit card debt. So to me, that suggests that households are very financially strapped and having a hard time covering their basic needs, and they're borrowing money to cover those needs. So although the mortgage default rate might still be really low, people are struggling with their debt and households are having a much harder time financially. And as an extension of that, that means there's not a lot of extra money floating around to bid up prices on homes. However, because people are so averse to losing money on real estate or to selling their home at all, we're probably going to see prices push sideways for a long time as people continue to carry the debt on their homes rather than cutting their losses and selling. Again, it's really important to consider the emotional and behavioral aspects here when you're trying to evaluate what home prices are going to do. I would also expect that this higher debt service stress is going to have a lot of knock-on effects to the rest of the economy because consumer spending is going to go down, which is going to affect a lot of different businesses. But more importantly, people are going to be generally less prosperous and less happy than they were when prices were going up like crazy and everybody believed themselves to be rich, even though it was all based on debt. Anyway, I guess to wrap up, I don't think this kind of analysis is really all that hard, it's just that not that many people do it. And people who do it are expecting you to pay them for it. I'm just one of the very few people who is deranged enough to be doing it for free. But for all the people out there who are asking me specific questions about what they think about such and such, or if I can do a deep dive into this or that, I would encourage you to actually try and seek out these answers yourself. You'll build up a lot of skills that will be very useful for you in answering these kind of questions for yourself, and you'll gain a better understanding of the issues. This is really the reason that I put as many sources in the video description as I can. The thing is, you shouldn't really trust me because I'm just some random dude on the internet. I'm not an expert, and I don't even really consider myself particularly smart or talented at this kind of analysis. The big difference between me and a lot of people on social media is that I put in the effort and actually do the analysis. But I'm not trying to get you to just agree with my opinion on things. What I want is for you to go out and form your own opinion. But to do that, I do think your opinion should have some kind of objective basis to it. And I try to present an objective basis for my opinion, but that doesn't mean you have to accept my interpretation. Your own interpretation is going to be based on your own knowledge, your own experiences, and your own values. And those are really the core of your belief system. But I do think the way that you express those experiences and values in your opinions should have a basis in fact. So I invite you to go out and investigate your own questions for yourself and talk to other people about it and see what they think. Obviously, you're not going to know exactly what you're doing at first, and you're going to make some errors of interpretation. But if you have constructive conversations with other curious people, your skills will build up over time. This is also why I'm not really interested in running for office, despite the encouragement of a lot of people in the comments section. I think that ultimately politics is downstream of culture. So the only way to raise the level of policy and discussions between politicians is to raise the level of our own discussions with each other. I can't just hand you a good opinion with a rich understanding of a subject. If we want to have better discussions with each other, then you do need to build a more nuanced understanding and form an opinion out of that. And the thing is, if we can get out of this sort of tribalistic attitude of arguing with each other over what side we perceive the other person to be on, then we won't have to commit to a mediocre idea from Team A or Team B. We might have 10 good ideas floating around, and we can debate amongst ourselves how many of them we want to pursue and which ones. So although what I do in my videos might seem complex, that's probably just because I've been doing this kind of analysis as a hobby for the last 20 years. And it's not super easy, but it's not super hard either. I really do think that the average person is smart enough to understand these issues in detail if they put in the effort. So if you want to take away from this video, it would be to go out, start looking at data for yourself, and see if it starts to tell you a story. Because the worst thing that's going to happen is you might learn something. Anyway, as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.